Okay, so it's 8 a.m. So let's get the show on the road. I want to welcome our online guests. This is sort of a last minute change, I realize, but I'm glad we were able to continue to offer the program today. We have a room very spread out today. We've got little groups of people at tables. I think we'll probably have about 15 live. And I think we had 45 or 50 signed up for the program, so I'm not sure what's going to happen in our attendance. But nonetheless, this is a program that I've been very excited about. I mentioned to one of our presenters earlier that I've been trying to find someone from corporate America to speak about active investors and how boards handle that. And unfortunately, the time I approached one of the large companies in town, it was during proxy season, which was not a very smart thing to do. So we continue to keep our ears open, and we're very fortunate that we were able to connect with Edelman, our speakers today, at this topic. I think it's really relevant to hear some really interesting stuff. So just a few rules for the road. So since we do have this hybrid arrangement today, we're going to do our best to manage this. I think we've done it a lot in the past, so we're just going to take it on as if we remember it. Muscle memory comes back to the pandemic era, and hopefully it'll all work out fine. So for those of you online, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to get a question in, and I'll stand at the podium to keep track of that. And if you've got questions, please feel free to raise them. And likewise for the crowd, we've got Roe on the outside and Kelly on the microphones so that questions will be identified and our speakers will hear the questions as well. So that'll get us through, I think, the program. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductory comments other than to say thank you to all of you who participated in our events this year. It's the last event for 2024. And we'll come out with an announcement for spring events as the new year gets here. And we're always excited to have great speakers for the breakfast series. We've had a couple of roundtables this year that have been well attended, and those have been fun. It's a nice way for members to get to know each other. And we'll have more fun things to look forward to in 2024. So before I ask Michael Stockham to introduce our speakers, I do want to thank our corporate sponsors for the year. That would include Texas Capital Bank. That would include Whitley Penn, and it would include Holland & Knight. And here today to provide the introduction for our speakers will be one of our members, Michael Stockham from Holland & Knight, to get us underway. So Michael, we're going to turn it over to you if you don't mind giving us a little rundown, and then we look forward to hearing our topic today. So Michael, the stage is yours. The screen is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. I greatly appreciate it, and also appreciate the opportunity to introduce our speakers today. As you all know, Holland & Knight has been a long time sponsor of the Institute, and it's an incredible pleasure to be able to participate and hear and learn from great speakers that the Institute brings in. This season is particularly interesting to me. We'll have a lot of shareholder activism coming up over the next few months. It's one of the areas in which I practice, and so I'm very interested in understanding what Julia and Josh have to say today. So let me go ahead and introduce our main actors on the stage today. Josh Hochberg is the global chief operating officer, and Julia Fisher is a senior vice president, both at Edelman Smithfield. They have decades of experience in shareholder engagement and activism. They have backgrounds in finance, capital markets, public relations, etc. They have several degrees, which I won't mention, all of which are prestigious. They deal normally with C-suite executives and boards of directors on such things as shareholder activism. So they are the experts, and they've been able to work with such marquee clients as T. Rowe Price, Discovery, Brooks Brothers, Nordstrom, DuPont, Campbell Soup, Molson Coolers, and others. So without further ado, we will introduce them. Josh and Julia, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. So I was thinking a little bit about this, and I was able to give a similar presentation a couple of weeks ago to a room of prospective boards of or prospective directors or individuals who have been serving as managers of large organizations and who are now taking sort of the next step in their career to become directors in public companies. And what I realized as we were having the discussion, and by the way, I hope that we can have a discussion today versus us just presenting slides, is that the director involvement in shareholder engagement has changed drastically since I started doing this over 25 years ago. I would tell you that, first of all, the concept of shareholder activism, shareholder primacy, and those kinds of things has changed significantly. How you would engage the board to handle these issues has changed significantly. And now there's an expectation, and we'll talk a little bit about this, on Wall Street and amongst not only active shareholders, but all shareholders, that boards are directly engaged in the process of dealing with shareholders, but that are also overseeing a company's priorities as it relates to shareholder engagement. And we're seeing all kinds of tools and other things that are starting to play into that, even the way the proxy is designed and written in terms of shareholder engagement, that leads us to believe that directors absolutely have an enormous role as it comes to this. So we'll talk a lot about that today. We'll talk about some trends that we're seeing out there. We'll talk about best practices. And I'm hopeful that you'll have some questions and some commentary based on your experiences that will make this a robust conversation. So really pleased to be here. And Julia, why don't I turn it over to you?
Great. Thanks, Josh. And I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. I just want to make sure, Greg, that it's not disruptive to the room for the participants virtually.
Yeah, I think everyone's muted, Julia. I'll mute. Oh, there's one that's not. I'm going to mute the room, okay, for now.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do first is to level set a little bit, share with you some of the trends that we're seeing, how boards are addressing them through shareholder engagement, and then leave you with some best practices that you can take to your boardrooms. Now, I will caveat and say that most of what we're going to be talking about is relevant to public companies, but there's likely a lot that you can take back to other boards on which you serve. So most of what we're seeing really is caused by heightened expectations. I think that everybody on this call in the room is feeling that from all stakeholders, and shareholders are no exception. Where we're seeing that play out first is in their stewardship priorities and proxy voting policies. Every year, the major investors publish documents outlining these things, and you can tell year to year how things are changing, how they're evolving, how their thinking might be shifting. Two good examples are climate risk and workplace or human capital management. Years ago, those probably were on the priority list, but likely lower down. Now, because of everything that has happened over the last 3 to 5 years, those have risen to the top. And that's something that we've seen in a lot of these documents over the last year or so. Companies are consistently engaging with their investors through their investor relations departments, with their management teams, often have conversations with investors, and their shareholders are expecting that feedback is going to reach the board. If they feel that they're not being heard or their concerns might not be addressed appropriately, they have no problem reaching out and requesting a meeting with a board director to make sure that their concerns are being heard. The universal proxy card is a noteworthy one. For those of you who might not be familiar with the universal proxy card, it went into effect last year, and before that, companies and dissident shareholders submitted separate proxy cards with their own slate of nominees for the board of directors. So shareholders were really looking at two different things. Now, everybody is required to use one universal proxy card, and all of the nominees are listed side by side. So it makes it much easier to mix and match what shareholders or who shareholders are going to be voting for. Now, what we're seeing is that companies are talking more about each director's expertise and the value that they bring to the board. That's coming through in proxy statements, through shareholder engagement, and also on investor relations websites. And lastly, boards are expected to engage regularly with investors. Most commonly, that happens during proxy season, 2 to 3 months leading up to the annual meeting, but also during key moments in time for businesses, M&A, transformative moments, and even crises. Investors want to know that boards are effective and engaged in some of these issues. As Josh mentioned, directors are more actively engaging with investors. In proxy statements, there is a section that's called a shareholder engagement program. And year over year, we're seeing more public companies disclose those programs and increasingly disclosing that directors are directly part of those programs. And so they're having more conversations with their shareholders. Preparing for those engagements is key. There's a robust program that happens before a director gets into the room with an investor. That includes prepping with the investor relations officer to understand what their most recent policies are, to understand who the shareholder is, what their voting policies are, and even a dry run with the corporate secretary before getting into the room with the investors. And because of this prep that happens beforehand, directors and investors are seeing that the meetings are more productive and more valuable as well. And then lastly, what we're seeing is that directors are inviting investors to come and present to them. It's really interesting to hear from top shareholders what their perspective is of the company. What's the company's competitive differentiators? What are they seeing in the marketplace? And it provides a really interesting perspective from a stakeholder that knows your company really well. Some best practices. First is know your shareholders. Who are your top shareholders? What are their voting policies? What do they care about? Who are the most important people to know within those companies? All of that is part of understanding them and also building relationships with your investors. To effectively oversee your shareholder engagement, there's a couple of things that you can do. A lot of boards have 1 to 2 people who are almost camera ready or ready to engage with investors. For some companies, it's the chair of NomGov. For others, it's the comp chair. For others, it's the lead independent director. It really is tailored to the board and the company itself. Investor relations materials and the proxy statement are some of the most helpful documents that are right at your fingertips, because when you review those, you understand how the company is talking about its strategy, its metrics, the results, and most importantly, how they're talking about it publicly. So those are really important to review and understand. And then lastly, and we'll talk much more about this, but to conduct an activist simulation with your board. When you're confronted with an activist, timeliness is key, and being prepared and knowing what the steps are in engaging with an activist are one of the keys to success. So with that, I think that's a great segue into Josh's shareholder activism section. But before I hand it over to him, I just want to ask if there are any questions. Great. Josh, over to you.
All right. So this is a fun topic. For a lot of directors, even now, I find I get into boardrooms and, there's a automatic, sort of the walls go up, sort of automatic defense mechanisms. But the fact is that they are shareholders, activist shareholders, or shareholders like any other. We're not going to wall them off like we may have 10 years ago. They matter. There's some statistics that I've seen over the years where they have small ownership positions in companies, but they have a big impact. right? Because they have a big impact because they have ideas. And gone are the days where management teams, boards can say, look, we're going to run our business despite what you say, right? They bring really complex, well thought out, analyzed due diligence and understanding of the business to the table. And it's always in the best interest to a certain extent, and we can talk about that, to listen to them, to hear them out, and in some cases, engage in their policies. So why don't we turn and just sort of set the framework for this a little bit. So tide of shareholder activism keeps rising. 408 campaigns in 2022. What's interesting here is if you look at the increase in campaigns over the years, proxy contests either haven't changed much. The number of campaigns that have actually gone to a vote, to a completion and to a vote, has either moderated or even to a large degree has decreased. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's happening, but generally it's what we've been talking about, which is engagement policy with the investor, engagement policy with the activist, hearing them out, and then sometimes, in some cases, employing their strategy. And I think all of you as directors know how costly a proxy fight can be, how it can be distracting. And so a lot of companies don't want to get into it. And we'll also talk a little bit about how other shareholders, sort of non-traditional activists, are thinking about activists now, which has changed dramatically over the years. Next slide. So what are the motivations? And it's always interesting to me because you can get into some really complex, conversations around what are investors, what are activists looking for, and how are they going to enact policy. But ultimately, it's pretty simple at the end of the day. It's dislocation and valuation, right? It's like there's nothing more to it. When we were talking about ESG over the last couple of years, there were some elements of that and sort of improving, and what Julia talked about in terms of sort of carbon neutral policies, diversity on the board, diversity on the management team, management of people. All of those things matter, right? But at the end of the day, most activists believe there's a dislocation between the potential of the company and how the company is treated in the market, period. And they have unbelievably sophisticated screens where they're monitoring that and watching that. And when they believe there's a dislocation, they take a really hard look at the business and they believe that they have a strategy that's better than the current strategy to bring that value to bear. It's really that simple. And so, and they'll take actions in order to do that. And that's typically in the form of replacing a member of the management. It could be cost cutting. It could be taking a completely new strategy to market. Early days in shareholder activism, it was about capital allocation, right? The easy thing would be to say, okay, I don't believe that you're utilizing capital in the right way, so you may as well just return it to shareholders, right? Well, I'm going to get a better return through a share repurchase or through a better dividend policy or the like. We saw that sort of fall off when a lot of companies say, well, that's not the answer, right? Like there's an operating point of view here that gets us to a better place. We're starting to see capital allocation policy come back into the fold a little bit. M&A, we'll see that M&A activism is probably the largest focus area currently. It's a little bit interesting given the interest rate dynamics right now and certainly antitrust issues and FTC policies right now in terms of M&A. So we've seen that sort of tail off in terms of action, but that doesn't mean that the activists still aren't coming to the table with it. Clearly, they're still taking a hard look at boards. Do you have board diversity? And what we mean by board diversity here is really skill set. And you'll see the sophistication of the skills matrix that are now in proxy materials that are articulated during proxy contests and when we're defending against active shareholders. And then we're looking at shareholder-friendly kinds of concepts like poison pills, like separation of the chairman and CEO, chairperson and CEO roles, those kinds of things. Say on pay, still a major issue. And I think the output of that has been an unbelievably detailed section of the proxy statement as it relates to pay and why pay is what it is. And there's other kinds of things. And then we'll talk a little bit about ESG over the course of the presentation, but I would say that ESG has evolved. It still remains top of mind for most shareholders, but I would say that it's not the primary focus of most economic oriented shareholder activists at this moment. Let's turn the slide. So who are they? So we have our traditional activists on the left, Elliott, Starboard, Jana. These are the institutional investors that we're dealing most with. Traditional large asset managers over the years have really changed their point of view on this. Not only are they willing to support a traditional hedge fund shareholder activist, but they're speaking up in ways they used to not. We've seen that with T. Rowe. We've seen that with CalSTRS and CalPERS and others that have a point of view on a company and believe they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to speak up. And then we see the ESG funds. This has changed quite significantly again over recent months even. Engine number one made their big play with ExxonMobil, as I'm sure everybody in that room knows. Their primary fund manager who was charged with that investment has since moved on. Jeff Ubben at Inclusive Capital, I'm sure all of you read, just shut down. But then we still have Trillium and Impactive who are still making a play and drafting shareholder proposals and those kinds of things. Next slide. Year to date, just some statistics for you, and some of this might come as a surprise, but let me explain. It shouldn't be a surprise that Elliott is by far the most active. They have the most funding, they are the most pervasive, they have the biggest brand, the biggest name. Just personally, my first shareholder activism issue years and years ago was with Elliott when they went after Hess. That was sort of my moment to start my career in this part of the business. Align Partners is actually a Korean-based fund, and they're going after Asian-based companies. The governance issues and other things have changed drastically in Asia. Tokyo is even more open to governance level changes than they've ever been before. There's significant dislocation in stock price in the APAC region. So Align is actually a big player these days. Starboard, Inclusive, again, closing down. And then Oasis is probably the largest focused investor in Japan. Next slide. But at the end of the day, right, so you think about this and you think about Elliott and you think about Starboard and you think about Jana, and 9 times out of 10, when I'm getting a phone call about shareholder activism, it's one of those kinds of organizations. But what really matters in these campaigns, what really matters when you're defending a company against a shareholder activist is how are your main institutional investors going to vote? How are they going to be thinking about what the activist is saying? And why is that important? Because I think everybody probably in the room knows that Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity, T. Rowe own the vast majority of the Fortune 500. They make the calls. They have the voting power. So, you get into Elliott, and so Elliott, for example, might have a 6-7% economic interest in a company. Or Starboard might have a 3, 4, 5% economic interest in a company. but they're not going to win anything without the support of Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street. And there's been a lot of debate and conversation about the power that those three wield. But ultimately, when you're a director on a public company, most likely, if all three of those organizations are in your stock, most of the time all three are, and they're going to have a point of view, and you're going to have to win their vote. Next slide. So what are they coming to the table? What are the themes that activists are coming to the table? Look, if you look at this middle, and this is what we were talking about, 46% currently year to date is around M&A. So pushing for a breakup or a divestiture, some push for sale, or they don't like a deal that's being announced. And we've seen a lot of that. And so they're coming to the table and saying, look, that the valuation associated with that is not good enough. And they've been successful doing it. Still, a large portion of this is your board's not right. We got to make some changes to the board, or your strategy or go-to-market is off base. I was just dealing with a situation where a large activist was in a company, and they said, "Look, just your approach to profitability is slightly wrong. Why don't we work together to announce something slightly different?" And they did. Earnings were great as a result, and the stock went up something like 20 or 30%. And guess what? The shareholder went away. Stayed in the stock, but not active anymore. So, when you think about, as a board, what pushes an activist to move out, it's about valuation. Next slide. So why don't we go through this slide, and then I'll pause and see if there's some questions. But some of the trends we're seeing, again, board representation remains a common goal. Just a quick note on that. Years past, activist shareholders would say, look, what's the harm of me coming onto a board? And the pushback was, it's not about harm, it's about what are you adding? And that still remains the pushback. I would say, though, that shareholders generally and Wall Street generally do believe that it doesn't hurt to have an investor point of view on a board. That's changed over the years, right? Where if you look at the skills matrix, it was really focused on operations. It still is. But a lot of shareholders believe that if you have a 7-8% interest in a business, maybe you do deserve a seat on the board. So the argument and the debate around that has changed a little bit. Over the course of this year, technology, especially software and internet, has been a main focus area. Industrials, including in engineering and machinery, has been a main focus area. Highly regulated industries in years past were sort of removed from the fold, insurance companies, banks, those kinds of things, because they believed that it was hard to enact quick change. Investors have become, activist shareholders have become so sophisticated now, they understand policy and regulation as well as the company does in many cases. And so they're now in the fold. Large cap companies used to be off the table. Really big organizations were off the table because, again, hard to affect change when you own 4% of an enormous organization. That's different now. There's a willingness by not just the Elliots of the world or the Starboards of the world, but all activist shareholders to go after large organizations. And then what we're also seeing, and this is really critical as you think about your directorship, what are some of we always say the best defense is a good offense, right? And so what are you doing to make sure that when the shareholders come in, that you have either the right answer for them or if you've already enacted change? So some of that is making sure that you have the right bylaws in place, that you have shareholder-friendly policies, or even non-shareholder friendly policies like poison pills. in place, and that you're ready to go once they do come in. And to Julia's earlier point, are you putting together a framework on the board to be prepared should Elliott or Starboard or someone else come knocking on your door? And then, of course, there's greater scrutiny on ESG campaigns. They're very sophisticated in terms of looking at ESG policy and disclosure, but ultimately there needs to be a very strong correlation with a credible economic thesis. So this isn't ESG for the sake of ESG. This isn't greenwashing. This is none of this. For large institutional shareholders, both active and passive, there's very specific policies as it relates to disclosure and actions, and then a very strong correlation to economic value. So why don't I pause there? That was a lot to start, but if there's questions or thoughts, we'd love to hear it.
So I think we do have a couple of questions, Josh. I think Dale had one from a prior slide. I couldn't get to the unmute button fast enough, but Dale, then David goes.
Okay, well, I'll start and I'll do a little more current. So when you talk about companies that are being targeted by activists, so to me, the examples will be good. So like, for example, Salesforce was on the list from a couple of activist investors. And like, what's interesting about Salesforce, obviously, they're one of the more innovative in terms of ESG and other things. They've been very current, yet they're targeted. And so that's just one of it. Can you just kind of give us an example why some companies that might be like them might be targeted?
So really for me, there's two reasons. One, this was not the case in Salesforce, but I've seen this in other instances where there's a smaller shareholder activist who's trying to make a case to their LP that they're taking action, to their LPs that they're taking action. And so they want to make a grand splash with a large branded organization where they have a point of view. So that's one element. And then the second element is, look, it's nuanced strategy. Right. So why does Starboard or Elliott or others believe that X large, huge organization, that with, multi-billion, billions upon billions in market cap need change? And again, it really goes back to sort of simplified dislocation in stock price. And they believe that there's a better strategy out there, or they believe that dividend policy is off, or something of the like. Right. Like, that is really all it comes down to. In some cases, so Elliott's interesting. If we take a look at Elliott for a second, right? So if you look at when Elliott comes after a business, they have a formulated point of view that in some cases meant due diligence over a period of a year when the public company didn't even know they were in the stock. And they use this phrase, sort of economic, that, economic position in the business, right? Notice that they're not, owners, right? Like, they have derivative securities that, as you all know, don't need to be disclosed to the SEC for a period of time that gives them an economic interest in the company. Right? They do sometimes a year's worth of research in the business, operations, governance. They speak to current employees, former employees, experts in the field, and they come up with a strategy or a solution to closing that delta on value dislocation that they believe, candidly, is better than what the management and board has come up with, or gets there quicker. And so by the time Elliott comes into a stock, oftentimes they have all the answers, right? And they hadn't reached out to investor relations. In some cases, they haven't reached out to management team. They haven't reached out to the directors, right? And you had no idea as an investor relations officer that they were even in the stock. That's happening more and more. There has to be an expectation from the board of directors that these shareholders have done their work, That's changed over the past 5 to 10 years where you could just dismiss them out of hand. You can't dismiss them out of hand because they might have better data than you do.
Dale, follow-up question? You good? Okay. I think we have one more behind Dale. Rose got the mic there.
Yeah, Greg, I may have a couple, so, but I'll take my turn. Josh, I'm always befuddled by ESG and DEI and the new four-letter words that are out there. Can you give us a little more color commentary on what the heck credible economic thesis means? Especially in light of BlackRock being a champion for ESG are now backing away. Maybe they're saying they just need to buy another name, but give us more commentary around credible economic thesis. And then I got a question for Julie, but I'll take my turn, Greg.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Look, I think you're confused like a lot of people are out there. But the fact of the matter is that the analysis behind ESG and what it means in terms of correlation of value has become incredibly sophisticated. And so I'm not sure that Mr. Fink is backing away from ESG. I think what he was saying, and maybe you'll agree with me, you don't, is that ESG as a phrase doesn't really carry the weight of what all this means anymore. Right? It has started to mean something different than what it was intended to. But that doesn't mean that they're backing away from ESG or DEI at all. As a matter of fact, if you look at voting policies for all the major shareholders, BlackRock, T. Rowe, State Street, you name them, they're very specific and deliberate about how they're talking about expectations of these policies, disclosure of these policies, and what they want out of them. I think maybe what's changed from a narrative standpoint to some degree is really two things. One, public companies, for the most part, have also become very sophisticated in terms of being able to take a look at their policies from carbon footprint to how they manage their people, to diversity amongst their employee base and on their board and those kinds of things, to long-term economic value. And they've built a narrative and with real data to support that. And so there's just a better understanding, clarity around those issues. That said, I think that just generally out there, there's just been, like everything else in our world these days, a sort of a counter narrative. And that has primarily been from, states and attorneys general who believe, and we can talk about this a little bit later, and I actually have a couple of slides on this, that this evolution from shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy does not align with the role as fiduciary, right? And so I think that that's really where more needs to take place, more evolution. Now, I will say that just because those states and the attorneys generals in those states have written letters and I will tell you companies have taken notice, doesn't mean that any of these companies or our large institutional investors have backed down from their ESG policy. It hasn't. But there will be the pendulum will swing likely, like everything else, back to neutral, where again, we take a hard look at, well, what do I, as a director, as a CEO of an organization, as a portfolio manager, what's my fiduciary duty for pensioners and others who are relying on me for their retirement and other things, right? So I think that's really what Larry Fink would say and others would say, that we just need to take a hard look at this and make sure that there is this correlation and that we're not speaking for the sake of speaking.
All right, let me rotate to the online guests for just a moment. We've got a couple more hands raised inside. Anyone online got a question they would like to raise? I don't want to skip over you if you do.
Craig, this is Jack. How are you doing this morning?
Go ahead.
I am interested. It's been a long time since I've been on public. I'm on private boards. I was on the LM Ericsson a North American board for a number of years in the early 2000s. The curve that you showed in the early slide of the growth of activism is scary, especially if you have private companies that might want to go public. Is that trend continuing? Is it more focused than it used to be? Because we had investor relationships, which I was in charge of, which were really very productive from our standpoint of understanding the perspectives of our shareholders, where they were coming from, and the priorities for the company, but it was not adversarial. And so the adversarial change is interesting. I'm dealing with some of the big M&A, Apollo, Pinnacle, and others now, and other transactions that might go public. And I am just interested in your view of the trends going forward. Is it going to continue as it is? Will it change? Is there anything a company can do to modify the aggressiveness of those aggressive activists?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that shareholder activism is now normal course, right? So I believe that what's going to happen is those numbers are going to keep going up until they just normalize, right? And shareholder activism has become its mainstay. It is an expectation for most public company boards now. And I want to think a little bit about the language you use around sort of aggressiveness, right? And because that's always a conversation we have with our clients, or like, they're aggressive, or they're pushing us in a direction we don't necessarily want to go.
Right.
I think it's more, and I would argue that most activist shareholders, unless you completely block them, are willing to work with you. And we're seeing that in the form of more settlements than ever before.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to this premise of they have really good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
They have well-founded ideas. They've done their due diligence. There are still activists out there, and we worked on cases recently where we call them sort of ankle biters, where they're going after companies for the sake of going after companies to make a name for themselves. And they really don't have a good point of view or a differentiated point of view, or they haven't brought value to the table. But when you're talking about the vast majority of activist shareholders, the ones that have helped redefine companies, turn businesses, they have a point of view that should be heard. They've earned a right at the table, I suppose. And trust me, like, having been doing this for almost 3 decades now, it's not something I would have said lightly even 10 years ago, right? But it's proven, right? They've made changes. They've updated boards that needed to frankly be updated, that had, directors on boards that were there for 30 years. And frankly, it was just time to move on, right? Diversity of experience lacked, where the board were just puppets for the management team, right? As you all know, boards are meant to be overseers of the business. They're supposed to direct, they're supposed to, show different ways, ask hard questions. That is happening in the boardroom more than ever. Change is happening quicker in the boardroom and amongst management teams more than ever. And it's because there's an understanding that not just Elliot or Starboard or Jana are going to stand up and say something, but that T. Rowe Price is, that they have a fiduciary responsibility for this, right? That the large state-run pension-focused institutions are going to stand up, in Texas teachers, CalPERS, CalSTRS, that they have a fiduciary responsibility to do this. There's now an understanding in boardrooms that shareholders are going to have a point of view. that healthy debate is okay, and that they can activate change that's good for all stakeholders. And we've seen that a lot.
Very good.
That
Thank you.
answer, Jack?
It does, yes.
Let's do one more
Excellent.
online, and we'll rotate back into the classroom. Anybody else online have a question? Okay, do you see we have a chat, so you might check your chat screen. Mike, did you have a question?
Yes.
Mike, you might just, I think Shay can hear you okay. So.
Can hear me? Okay. Everything that you've been telling us is extremely interesting, and you have a group of folks that study governance and the whole big market itself. In terms of who's actually got their hands on companies and are in their actual boardrooms, I think a lot of the things you're talking about are probably what I call the top third of the Russell 3000, and I think we get our hands in this group more onto the bottom third of the Russell 3000, micro caps, pre-IPO companies. And so how do the generalizations and trends you're talking about here play out down at that end of the range? And how do you prepare a board?
Yeah.
That
It's a, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I think that was it.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And there's more work to do, frankly. I would say sort of the bottom half of the Russell, we're probably not seeing the board diversity, the shared, the diverse experiences at the board level that you would see at sort of the top of the mark. Some of that's not in most cases, or in many cases, not the fault of the company, but just the availability of directors that are willing to sit on those boards or whatever. But I would say that what I'm seeing is that the small caps and the mid caps are doing the prep that the large caps are doing, right? And and they're hiring us and other advisors to say, okay, do we have the right governance policies in place? Should we be changing bylaws as a prophylactic to shareholder activism? Should we be putting, given our stock price, especially at the microcaps, should we be putting poison pills in place? Are we bringing in the right advisors, even if they're on the board or not, to make sure that we really have the right strategy in place? So while it might take a little bit more time for them to get there, I think a lot of them are doing the work. Now, it's funny, like when we were talking about ESG disclosure policy, I remember sitting in a room with a bunch of other advisors, and we were thinking about what is ESG disclosure policy going to look like for public companies, right? And I did exactly what you just did, which is it's really easy for a large organization like ExxonMobil or someone else to put all the resources in play to get the right disclosure policy in place, to make sure it's framed the right way and it's in front of the right people. I said, what about these micro cap companies that don't have the resources to do any of that, right? How are they going to disclose ESG when they can barely get their earnings results out, right? And I'm sure all of you have dealt with that, right? It's last second where the CEO and CFO are rushing to get those documents out. But the fact is that these companies are, because they're having to employ more resources to the degree they can to make sure that they're not reacting to activists, but they're not an activist target to begin with.
That help, Mike?
Yeah, that helps. I mean, I've had a broad experience of two of these that I was kind of up close to. And in both of them, basically the BlackRock's, the bigger institutional investors' message back to management was, yes, we don't know these guys, we don't have any faith in them, but be respectful to them, listen to what they have to say, and don't waste a lot of time on them unless they do have something of value. We don't want to see you creating World War III with these guys, because you need your focus on the business.
BlackRock, T. Rowe, State Street, Fidelity, they hate proxy fights. if you talk to the stewardship teams and the portfolio managers at any of these, they do not want to see the distraction. So don't fight for the sake of fighting. We used to see that a lot in the world of shareholder activism, right? I'm right, you're wrong. I'm going to fight you to the end. I'll take you to the proxy fight. Now, in some cases, that does make sense. Why? Because you have to ask yourself the question, is my strategy better than the investor's strategy? And the investor is asking themselves the same question. And if you have a fundamental belief that you're going to bring about shareholder value in a better, more efficient way than what the investor's plans are, then sure, go to a proxy fight. And most institutional shareholders will support you if they believe the same. But generally, they don't like proxy fights.
I think we have one more question from the room, then we'll get back to the presentation. Ro, will you run the mic? Yes. Ro, over here. Yeah.
Yeah, Julia, this might be a question for you. Outside of who's vocal on earnings calls, what are best practices in deciding how do you prioritize which investors boards ought to be interested in? So again, outside of who's vocal on earnings calls, how do you prioritize which investors board should be actively involved and engaged with?
Good question. I'm going to let Josh lead and then I'll follow up.
So you're asking which shareholders we should be most focused on as a board? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of that is about listening, right? And this is where the board dynamics have changed quite a bit, where there was really this siloed approach to investor engagement, where the CEO, CFO, investor relations office was handling the vast majority of shareholder engagement, and the board, I mean, I would tell you that the board rarely in years past would ask questions about it, right? And what's changed now, and I would highly recommend this for all of you who sit on public company boards, is make sure that there's a very clear understanding on a very regular basis, oftentimes quarterly, and there's moments within your board meetings to ask questions about shareholder engagement and who's asking what kinds of questions, right? So that's one element. So just understanding what investors are asking. What is State Street asking about your business, and how is that different from how Fund Y is asking what they're asking about your business, and how are we answering those questions? So that's number one. Number two, on an annual basis, some representation from the board, in my point of view, should be going on non-deal roadshows. So if it's a lead independent director, the chair of the nom-gov, chair of the comp committee, certainly the chair of the comp committee should be talking to stewardship teams at large institutional investors on an annual basis. And we say it's sort of non-wartime engagement, right? So outside the confines of proxy season, because you're not going to get those teams anyway during proxy season. And boards should be pushing their investor relations office for that, right? So you ask, like, how do you prioritize? You prioritize by listening and understanding what your active shareholders are asking, what they're expecting of the company, of the business, and then what the stewardship teams at these large institutions are thinking in terms of policy, say on pay, governance, bylaws, right? So like, you are not reacting to them at that point, you're listening and then pushing management and investor relations on policy to make sure you have the right policies in place. Is that helpful?
Okay, are y'all ready to move on to the?
Yeah, we have a long, we're not going to get through everything, but let's keep going, because there's probably some interesting slides in here that everybody will be interested in. So Julia talked a little bit about UPC. I think everybody generally probably knows what all of this is about. I would just say this, and this slide and the next slide, Julia, is that UPC probably didn't have the impact that everybody thought it would have. It's not like all of a sudden every shareholder and their mother became an activist investor because it was cheaper to do, and all of a sudden it was really easy to get your board candidates on the proxy, on the voting materials. It just didn't turn out that way. What did happen was, and Julia noted this, was that there was more focus on individual directors, because directors now understood that they could be highlighted and focused on in new ways. There are proactive measures that we've been talking to our clients about, and I'm hoping that you'll bring to your board as well, which is taking a very hard look at the current makeup of your board, looking at yourselves as individuals and saying, what do I bring to the table? And are those highlighted in the right ways? Even if you look at on the governance sections of the investor relations websites, how directors are represented in those sections now, the sophistication by which they're represented. How long have they been on the board? Highlighted. What specific background, not just the sort of the typical, background of the director, but like, what are the bullet points of the issues that you bring to the board that's different from other directors? Other public companies, situations that they've been involved in with, and they have to balance that with overboarding. In some cases, we've worked with organizations to do videos of directors, Q&A with directors, so that investors get to know them in a different way. And like I said, then there's engagement. So I don't think that we saw increased volume of campaign just because of UPC, but we certainly have seen more focus on individual directors and potentially more change up on the board as a result of that. Next slide. Let's get, I think I basically all said it. So we talked a little bit about the evolution of all these things, right? So we moved from, what was pretty much made up the entirety of my career and probably all of your careers, which is shareholder primacy. When you developed an earnings script for, your quarterly results, when you built an earnings release, when you wrote a 10K, the audience in your head and the audience that mattered was the shareholder, period, the end. Right? This was a public company and your fiduciary duty was to generate value for shareholders. That's the world that we've been living in for most of our lives and most of our careers, right? Over the course of the next slide, then all of a sudden we started thinking about stakeholder primacy. It all started with Business Roundtable. It was diversity in the workplace. It was carbon emissions. It was all of these things. Do we believe that, and it was soft in early days and it's harder now, is there a correlation between doing the right thing for society and value and generating value? And generally that was the belief. It probably overextended. I think we had some conversation around this, probably overextended to a degree. And now it's being pulled back, next slide. And now we're looking potentially again at shareholder primacy, but in a different form, right? I think that there's some clarity that at the end of the day, it's still about generating value. That, as Larry Fink said, that ESG was weaponized in ways that probably shouldn't have been. And then we're seeing these pension systems that, largely red states sort of say, look, again, and we talked a little bit about this, what should I be doing? What's my fiduciary duty, right? So the pendulum's swinging, right? And we know that it's swinging everywhere. It's swinging in politics, it's swinging in social dynamics, it's swinging on college campuses. At some point, and we're starting to see this happen, it's coming back to neutral. Next slide. So anatomy of an activist engagement. Let me just walk you through a little bit about how these things come about. Again, we talked about this, right? It's price performance, it's operating performance. Is there a perception, or is there proof that the business strategy isn't working the way it should be? And that if there are strategic alternatives, and I use that term loosely, that can be enacted to make sure that there's a case for greater value. Is there an unused cash balance or misuse of capital? Is there poor governance? Is there egregious executive compensation? Is there a failure to respond to a negative shareholder vote? If you're getting 50% say on pay vote year after year after year, and you don't do anything about it, you're likely going to be at the receiving end of shareholder engagement. You will be at the receiving end of shareholder engagement. Right. So this is, if you look at these 6 things and, as a director, you're saying, okay, well, we got to go one by one and making sure that we have a plan in place for all of them. Right. So if you look at what Wachtell Lipton has said about this, or being your own long-term focused activist, that's what we always tell boards. Think and act like the activist. If you do that, and you push your management team to think like that, and you push your investor relations office to think about that, and you push your marketing operations to think like that, then you will enact policy that removes some of this, or at least gives you answers to them. Next slide. So how does this play out? It can play out in a number of ways, depending on the activist. In some cases, like I said, you don't know the activist is in until they've made public that they're in. That can come in the form of them leaking a story with the press. It can come in the form of a 13D being filed, where there's a section within the 13D where they talk about the problems that they have with the board, with the management team, with how the company is pushing through their operational plans. It could be in a call that one of you gets from an investor saying, I don't believe that the company is approaching this the right way. So there's multiple permutations depending on the situation for how this could play out. I would say a year ago, you would at least have had a call before they file that 13D with an associated letter to the board, or they've leaked out with the press. I'm not totally convinced that's the case as much as it used to be. I've seen too many situations over the course of the last year where the 13D comes out, the letter to the board comes out, some sort of white paper or management presentation comes out publicly, where, Julie and I are getting calls from the Wall Street Journal saying, hey, I'm hearing that Elliot's gonna, try to engage and ask for change. It's happening more often where they are not behind the scenes engaging with the company yet. But we're hopeful that there's still a dialogue that happens despite the publicity around some of these things. Next slide. So if you look at various shareholders have different tactics. So Corvex is well known for submitting shareholder proposals during proxy season. Carl Icahn, Elliott, Starboard, they're going to lobby shareholders for public support early in the process. They fully expect that organizations like Carl Icahn, like Elliott, like Starboard are having conversations with your shareholders. That all of these, Pershing, Square, Ackman, Trian, Jana, they're all going to put up nominees that are very, very high quality. And they have very specific point of view on industries, retail industry, 20 years of experience, supply chain, right? They have a portfolio of these directors ready to go. They're going to hire investment bankers or going to do their own sophisticated presentations. Like I said, some of the presentations coming from Elliott are as sophisticated as any investor deck that a public company would ever put forth. There is a willingness to incur a substantial campaign expense That's something that UPC didn't really change. We thought it was going to be really cheap for shareholder activists to initiate a campaign. But many of these, they don't care. They'll spend millions of dollars on a campaign because they believe in the return on investment. They'll litigate. We've seen that more often. They'll wage multi-year campaigns. We talked a little bit about Kohl's before everybody was in the room. Kohl's has been going on for 3 years now. And then more often, they're going to use their own capital to acquire the business. We've seen that with Elliott. We've seen that with Carl Icahn. Next slide. ISS and Glass Lewis, right? And this has been controversial over the years, the control that they wield, the potential conflicts with the other side of their business. But the fact is that ISS and Glass Lewis have the proxy to vote for a large portion of the shareholder vote. And so when you're in a campaign, it's really critical to understand policy by ISS and Glass Lewis. How do they typically vote? What do they look at? A lot of it's about case for change. All of this is about case for change, but for ISS and Glass Lewis, they're going to be asking that very specific question. Is there a case for change? Do you have a better strategy than the shareholder? And if you don't, we're gonna recommend that our clients vote in favor of the shareholder. So as a board, there should be a lot of sophistication, not only of understanding how shareholders vote, but how ISS and Glass Lewis are proxies for the vote and their policies in particular. Next slide. So why don't we pause there for a moment? What's our cutoff time, by the way? Just so I know.
It's 9:30. So
we have about 20 more minutes.
Yeah.
Great. So why don't we pause before we talk about engaging with the activists, which, by the way, we've already talked about quite a bit, and see if there's some other questions.
Okay. Over here. There she's got.
With the increased use of generative AI, what do you anticipate this will do with activism? First, them fighting misuse of data, or secondly, using generative AI to create more warfare?
Well, I would say that the most sophisticated shareholders are already using AI in a lot of different ways. Again, it's putting these screens together to determine dislocation down to the microsecond. It's to look for certain words within proxy statements, earnings materials, and doing it with such ease, accuracy, and speed that it's completely changed the game. And same for public companies, the way that they're presenting shareholder materials and the use of generative AI to make sure that it aligns to the expectations of shareholders, to the voting policies that we've talked about, to how ISS and Glass Lewis engage, and all those kinds of things. So the sophistication has increased significantly. Of course, though, like anything else, like what's happening generally in the world, what's happening in politics, there's going to be some questions about accuracy, disinformation, and those kinds of things. So it comes back to what's the policy of the board and how they're looking at the business, making sure that there's rules of engagement, rules of the road, that there's a very clear understanding for what the strategy is, and that you have a plan in place to respond to some of the disinformation that's out there in a way that is quick, effective, and meaningful. And we're seeing that in crisis situations. A good way to get through that is to make sure that you're doing simulations at the board level for times of crises and for times of shareholder engagement.
Thank
Other
you.
question? Yep.
I think Dennis has a question. Dennis Kagan?
Yes, thank you, Greg. Can you tell me, you mentioned the increasing quality of PE recommended independent, or not independent, but PE recommended directors. There was an issue previously about PE firms paying or supplementally paying those directors in addition to the normal board comp. Is that still happening, or has that trend stopped? And the second part of that question is there any real obligation on the part of those directors to vote in favor of the PE firms versus their normally legal fiduciary duties of care?
So, in terms of compensation, I'm not sure of the trend there. I do know that it has become pretty traditional for companies to take a very hard look at these candidates, to take them through the interview process. And at that point, it becomes less about the fund putting them up for election and more about whether or not they are the right fit for it. And I will tell you this, if you as a board take them through what needs to be a very deliberate and prescribed process for interviewing candidates, and there's a whole process for that, and you should be working with your law firms and your PR firms and your investment banks on that if you don't have that process in place. But ultimately, once they are put up as a potential director, compensation or not, they should be screened to a degree for fit, right? And if you don't believe that they are the right fit, or don't believe that it's time, like now is the right time to put them on the board, you better have a really good reason for not.
Understood, but there's still a potential conflict of interest if they're also being paid by the PE firm.
Right, and so once they're put up on the board, you have to remove those conflicts of interest for sure. Right, and so again, the concept is not that they are sort of they're not the fund representative. That at the point upon moving to the board, that their duty, the policy is that their duty is that they oversee the business, period, and that they don't have a separate agenda.
Okay.
Now, will they have the point of view of the investor in mind? Yeah, that's the point, right? Like that's always the point. But generally, I think investors have moved beyond that at this point. They understand that once they become an independent member of the board, that and usually the folks that they're putting up understand that as well, and that will be part of their consideration for being a candidate that they put up, that they have independence once they're on the board.
Great, thanks, Josh.
Yep.
Anything else in the room? Okay, Josh, I think you're free to go.
Yeah, let's keep going through a couple of these slides. So engaging with the activist. So first of all, make sure you have a team in place, and I would say make sure you're doing this not when Elliot's knocking on your door or Starboard's knocking on your door. Most of the well-run boards, most public companies are doing this in peacetime. That they have an investment bank that they trust that has shareholder activism experience. They've engaged with the shareholder activism team at the investment banks, that they have a law firm that knows how to do this. And I will tell you, like, there's a small ecosystem amongst advisors that really know shareholder activism better than others. So, you might have your securities attorneys on board, and they may very well have a very strong shareholder activism group. But I will tell you that quality is diverse. Have a firm like ours. Make sure that you're going through plans, that you have a break glass plan in place, that you're going through crisis management prep programs at the board level, and make sure that your management team is very involved in there. Proxy solicitors are a little bit different. You're going to have your regular way proxy solicitor that's going to be helping you on an annual basis with your proxy materials and with your voting policies and those kinds of things. There are a select group of proxy solicitors that understand shareholder activism engagement better than others. And there's groups within them that understand these special situations. So I'm not suggesting, probably different from the other three, that you have a shareholder activism focused proxy solicitor on call during peacetime, but believe me, they are critical once you do get that call. They will know ISS, Glass Lewis, and the voting policies of your shareholders better than any other group. And they should. And if they don't, and you ask them those questions as directors and you don't feel comfortable, look for a different proxy solicitor. Next slide. So we've talked about this. It's not to be taken lightly. Campaigns are disruptive. They distract your management teams. They're expensive. You know, a prolonged activist campaign can cost millions upon millions of dollars and manpower, just a tremendous amount of human resources. There's no adherence to fixed timetables anymore. It used to be the couple of months leading up to the AGM. Activism is a year-long program now. They can come into the mix. Activists come into the mix and do come into the mix outside of proxy season most of the times now. All of the engagements that I'm currently on, although we're sort of getting close to the season, or we're in the season, most of these started outside of the season where we've got phone calls. There can be a media circus, not in every situation, but there can be a media circus, especially if it's sensational, some kind of issue, for example, with plane usage or use of company funds. You know, those campaigns are interesting. But even if it's just like someone mentioned Salesforce, right? Like brand names or a brand name activist, that's likely going to get a lot of media attention. It's not only distracting for your board and your management team, but it's distracting for your employees. It's distracting for your customers to a degree, and certainly your vendors and partners. So there needs to be an employee communications program around activism when it's happening. Remember that when you are thinking about and contemplating a transaction, yes, you're always thinking about value. Yes, you're thinking about integration and synergies, revenue synergies, cost synergies, dis-synergies, all of those kinds of things that as a board we know you're thinking about, but also know that there's going to be sort of a voice that's going to come in and have a point of view on this. Think about that. Be your own activist. And then activist campaigns can mean the arrival of other activists. We are on an M&A activism situation late last year. I'm trying to think of the timing, but where there were literally 10 activist shareholders that showed up. 10. All with a different point of view. So think about managing that as a board, as a management team. Next slide. So what do you do? Actively listen, right? Make sure there's a plan in place to hear their point of view. Don't dismiss them. Set a record of engagement. That's going to become critical when you start developing your materials for a defense campaign. Make sure that you're publicly communicating around your decisions regarding corporate strategy, governance. Communicate effectively. Take a hard look at all your materials. Make sure you're always thinking about your focus on shareholder value and how you're discussing your pathway to shareholder value with all shareholders. Make sure the board is highly involved. We talked a lot about that. right? We can't be passive onlookers to shareholder engagement as directors. So those are generally things that we should be doing, that you should be thinking about as a board when activists show up. What not to do. Next slide. Typically, especially when you're in a proxy fight, anything that you say, board minutes, sharing of emails, just know that that can at some point be disclosed. Take special care when you're thinking about board minutes, when you're thinking about disclosures, when you're thinking about decisions to disclosure. Worst thing you can do with a shareholder activist is be, overly aggressive, defensive, debate opinions, right? The rule is listen, have a point of view on your business, but remain calm. Shareholders are activist shareholders will often try to drive a wedge between members of the board. So it's never a good idea to disclose confidential board discussions. There must be a unified front on the board. Almost every proxy fight that I remember losing was because the board was not unified in how they're thinking about things. There was absolutely a wedge that was, and it was a designed wedge by the shareholder. Don't work in definites, because that's going to hurt you down the road. Make sure that you're not even showing that you're fully open to any specific transaction or proposed action, right? It's not about the individual point of view on the board. It's about the board's point of view and the management's actions as a result of that. And then don't debate hypotheticals. That's really dangerous to do. And again, it will hurt you down the road. Next slide. So that's it. Look at that, 1022.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive. So we have 8 minutes left for any remaining questions or comments, and by the way, Julie and I are always available to have one-on-one discussions. If you're having some issues at the board level, or you just want to keep talking about this, we're absolutely willing to do that. I will finally say, I'm sorry we couldn't be there with you in person. I promise next time we will be, so that we can maybe learn a little bit more about each other and network a little bit more and shake hands.
All right, let's give these guys a round of applause.
Thank you.
We do have 7 minutes left, though, so could we take advantage of that? I see a couple of questions in the room. So let's start back in back corner and then move to my right. So I'll keep us to 9:30, okay?
Thank you.
Don't help me.
Do you recommend as a best practice appointing one of the board members to be the point person in all discussions with the activist? If so, what type of board member would you recommend being such a point person?
Yeah. It's case by case. Typically, the lead independent director should be involved. Then others are going to be dependent on the kinds of questions that are being asked, or the line of issue. So for example, if you're getting questions on SAN pay, then the board members who are responsible for setting the pay agenda must be available to talk about it. If though, for example, the activist is asking questions around operations or supply chain, and you have a director, best case, an independent director that has real supply chain experience, they should be the individual having some conversations. So I don't think that there's any one rule of thumb. I would probably recommend against the full board engaging with an activist. Like, that's not something that we like doing. And then the only other thing that I would say is that, or two other things would be, independence is better to show that the board's not the puppet for the management team. And 3, that to showcase that the board has a very, very clear understanding of the business, the operational model, and the go forward strategy.
All right, one more.
Thank you. When it comes to specifically small cap public companies, would you find that the preponderance of activists have the end game in mind of acquiring a company, taking it private? Or is it more of a wide variety of reasons?
It's probably easier for a small public company, especially a controlled one, to generate value through a take private transaction, and we see that all the time. But it's also candidly potentially easier to enact some operational changes that's going to generate some incremental value. So, for example, it's easier to deal with, a cost basis at a small cap company than it is at Disney, for example. So if the activist believes that you're sort of managing costs inappropriately, it's easier to make some of those changes than at an organization who has to think about, dozens of billions of dollars, right? So we see a really a mix, but yes, you're right. M&A activism, take private activism is probably more likely at a small cap.
But one insight, also, I want to go back to the online participants after Larry asks his question. Get one more round. So Larry.
Thank you. So Josh, you mentioned earlier the ankle biters, and I think that's an appropriate term, but but I had a question is, have you seen any strategies to minimize the disruption or to avoid them getting the prices? Sometimes they don't even bring a credible issue to the table, but they're just there to make noise. So are there any strategies that you've seen or can suggest to try to avoid that or minimize that?
I mean, the best again, these things are all about, is your strategy better than the others? So and I sort of, I don't want to sell like what we do too hard, but communicating your strategy in a way that's better than others is the first line of defense. Second is, oftentimes with these smaller activists who don't have a brand name, it's about the engagement of your sell side and the engagement of your other shareholders, right? If T Rowe doesn't agree with the ankle biter, it's not going to last very long. And then have a plan to respond to them, right? I mean, we've just seen so many situations where their strategy is so off base that it's almost sort of dismissed right away, but you got to do the work to dismiss it.
Yep. Okay, online, anybody got a hand they want to raise before we call it a day? Okay, Josh, I'm going to take advantage of our 3 minutes that's left. Is there a private company application for this? And I'm thinking of maybe a large family business that's in its second or third generation of ownership, where maybe a branch of the family has a different viewpoint on how the business should be run, and in fact could be sort of an activist investor in a non-public setting. Do you all ever see situations like that?
Absolutely. We've seen situations where different family members have a different point of view. We've seen that a lot in media organizations, right? Where they just don't believe that the company is moving in the right direction. And so they've actually driven their own wedge into the board. They've gotten their own representation. We've been hired by specific family members on boards to make a case for change. You'll probably see, like over the years, controlled companies used to be off the table because the activists would say, I can't make a case for change here. It's going to be impossible to enact. That has come off the table because, the shareholder dynamics have changed, and how the large institutions respond to that has changed. So yes, absolutely. There's been cases where board members, family members do not believe that the company is moving in the right direction and have become their own activists.
Given the number of privately owned businesses we have around here and our involvement, that might be a good future program, actually. I don't know.
Happy to put something together for that.
Okay, well, it's 9:30. Let's give once more a round of applause.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
This has been great. We appreciate your preparation and your work in putting this together. Thanks to all who joined us online. Thanks to all who came in person. You're welcome to stick around. I know they'll come and start taking tablecloths off of you. Stay. Don't worry about it. There's plenty of coffee. So we will see everyone later. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Happy holidays to everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
You too.
The slides will be shared. Yes, we'll get the slides out. So, all right. See you guys.